What a treat this is to have the opportunity to visit with him, the nation's longest serving House member, not the longest serving there now, but the longest serving period. Mr. Dingell, back in '55, under President Truman, filled in his father's seat and has carried on some of the important work that his father was doing. Congressman, what an honor. Thank you very, very much for being here. I also wanted to recognize Mrs. Dingell, who's with us tonight as well on the stairs. Say hi. She's been a supporter of Politico from day -1. She's always talked it up and been a reader, and we're appreciative for that, and is seen all around town. Just to tell you a little bit more Mr. Dingell's story. He's currently, as you guys all know, Chairman Emeritus of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. And the list of legislation he's worked on over the years, from the Endangered Species Act, Do Not Call, Clean Air Act, he's been there on a lot of these big issues. I was most moved by the fact that there was reaching for one piece of paper. I'm most moved by the fact that he often refers to his father's work and carried that on. So thank you, sir, for coming to visit with us. I really appreciate it very much. Now, you have seen, we've been talking a little bit about energy, so do you want to do healthcare for a little bit? Or
I want to do what you want to do.
Okay. Let's talk about, just to give ourselves a change of scenery for a second, let's talk about healthcare. You've seen iterations of this under Eisenhower, under President Truman, under President Johnson, President Clinton. How do things seem this year? What do you think the outlook is this year? How are things different from maybe something big happening on healthcare?
Well, we're the only country in the world that doesn't have it. Germany got it under Bismarck in the 1880s. England under King Edward VII in 1907. We almost got it under a famous creeping socialist by the name of Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. We almost did it in 35. And they decided they were going to hold off until 36 because it was too big a bite to chew. But they found in 36 that two things happened. One, they had, well, three. One, they lost a lot of seats, the Democrats did. They had a war coming on, which became very clear at that time. And they had an economic downturn, and they lost a lot of seats. So they had to put it off. Truman tried to do it again in 43. Then Dad introduced the first bill on Medicare. And they worked very hard to get that through, but nothing happened until Lyndon Johnson came along. Kennedy and Johnson tried it during the 60s. They even had what they called a special session. It was a late session. And they couldn't do it. Turned out that they found for the first time this is a bad idea, to have these kind of post-election sessions. But the upshot of it is that it really didn't get to be a serious issue, even though we got, in '65, we got Medicare through, and we thought that was going to be the step that would lead us to a program of national health insurance. The upshot of that, however, was that we did it, but we never got to step 2. The result was that we really never got around to any serious business on this until Clinton came along. And Clinton, God bless him, really tried. But the trouble with it was that let a fellow by the name of Ira Magaziner handle it. And Ira didn't hurry it. And the result was that the bill dawdled around. The president made a speech on it in February. It was a superb speech, pulled him out of a deep hole. He was in difficulty, as you'll remember at that time. And he made this speech, and this was sort of the centerpiece. And we thought, oh boy, we're going to do it. Well, the bill didn't come up until November, and it was surrounded with all manner of troubles. Yeah. By which time the insurance industry had spent $500 million.
Harry and Louise, right? Yeah.
Pardon?
Those ads were Harry and Louise, I think. Yeah.
Harry and Louise. Now, they didn't play Harry and Louise very many times, but they didn't have to. We lost by one vote in committee. We lost a very interesting fight over one vote when the Business Roundtable had it. And the insurance companies beat the daylights out of industry that manufacturers, which even at that time was beginning to feel the troubles. Well, that brings us to today, because nothing happened during the interim between Reagan and with the two Bushes and Reagan. Well, the upshot of it was that we are now finally getting ready to address the question. Industry is going broke. When Dad started out on it, the assumption was that we had to do it because it was humanitarian. Still have to. And I won't go into the justification on that basis, but the harsh fact of the matter is that Michigan produces less cars than Ontario does now. Why? It costs about $4 an hour less to make a car in Ontario because of the fact of cars. And folks say, well, GM is an auto producer, but it ain't. GM is a company that provides health care and makes cars to pay for it. And when you look out the window and you look at one of those nice American cars out there, there's $750 worth of steel in it and $1,600 worth of health care. And people all throughout industry are coming to realize that they can't sustain this anymore. And the hospitals are coming to understand they can't. And the doctors are finally understanding that the system is scheduled for collapse. And there are all kinds of failures that are associated with it. Shortage of nurses, shortage of paramedical folk, and all kinds of things of this sort. Well, the end result is that we simply have got to do something about it. Now, the big fight, I think, is probably going to be about money and how we pay for it. There's a few of the conservatives who would fight this to the death under any circumstances. And there are folk who are worried about the money. And we are going to have to address that question.
But you suggested earlier, Mr. Chairman, that the people who will fight it to the death are greatly reduced now, right?
There's a lot less of them. Yeah. And funny thing, when times turn bad, people begin to look to see, how do you make them better? That happened during the Depression. When you see you've got an economic downturn, if it lasts long enough and it's bad enough, all of a sudden folk get real concerned about what's going to happen to them. And if you look, you can see. And the handwriting's on the wall on this because folks saw it during the last election. And whether you like it or not, and I think Obama's a very good president. I think he was a superb candidate. And he ran one of the best campaigns I've ever seen, best finance too, by the way. But people, I think, largely voted on the fact they knew everything was going bad. And it was real interesting. All of us saw the great big piece of legislation that Hank Paulson sold Bush on. And that ranked with the conversion of St. Paul because they had Bush came out for spending $700 billion to give the banks. He had to be scared to death.
Well, yeah, and you all were told that the world's economy would collapse if you didn't vote for it.
Well, they told us that, and quite frankly, I think there was some truth in it, because the banks had just frozen up. There were no loans, and no money was moving, and that was exactly what happened in '29. And had we had the wisdom in '29 to do some of the things that we have done early on in this, students of the economy and the Depression and historians and so forth tell us that that depression would have been both shorter and less severe. And the folk who study these things today are telling us that Obama and Bush earlier on, although he did it reluctantly, did about the right thing.
And Mr. Chairman, reading between the lines of the very fascinating little flashback that you give us here, I got the sense that maybe you think that Senator, now Secretary Clinton, got more blame in sort of the popular retelling later than she really deserved for what went on under Clinton. You talked about a number of other very interesting factors. Has she been blamed too much for not getting that bill under President Clinton?
Well, I was the guy who was probably at the center of this in the House I thought she did a good job.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think that Ira did.
Mm-hmm.
And the result was, of course, we failed by one vote. I'm a great admirer of Hillary Clinton's, and I've worked for her during the campaign, and I think she would have been a fine president. But that doesn't take anything away from Barack Obama. He's doing a whiz-bang good job, and I'm very proud of the work he's doing.
I wonder if you could, Mr. Chairman, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the president's energy and climate change proposals. You've been very active, very vocal about this in the last few weeks. I wonder if you could just bring us up to date. Where are things now? What are your hopes? What are your worries?
Well, first of all, I think we have to do something. And you can pick your ground on which we should do it. You can say that the oceans are going to rise and that we're going to have global warming with all the evil consequences that attends. And I've got to tell you that is probably the case, and I'm willing to support it on that ground. But we've got a much better reason, short term. Very frankly, we can't continue to afford the amount of money that's going out of this country to buy oil. And very frankly, it's, the United States has 3% of the oil, about 5% of the world population, and we use 25% of the oil. Can't afford that. And we've simply got to get a handhold on this thing. So I strongly support the idea we have to do something. And last year, I had the staff on the Commerce Committee work with a lot of people in the environmental movement and other things, and with the folk at US CAP. And we came up with what was a pretty doggone good bill. And everybody said it was a good bill. I was rather surprised. Well, the upshot of the whole business was we, of course, ran out of time and couldn't get it done. And, of course, there was an election going on, which makes it a bad time to do any kind of thoughtful legislating. So this year, Henry Waxman, as chairman of the committee, and Ed Markey, chairman of the subcommittee, have put together what's a pretty good bill. Matter of fact, I was thoroughly surprised. It comes fairly close to what it was I thought we ought to have, and fairly close to the bill that we had. And with, I think, some small changes, it can become something that would be a very good piece of legislation. We're working, Henry is working very well with the committee. The Congress has gotten, unfortunately, away from what we used to call the regular order, the way we used to legislate. And it's a really was a very unfortunate thing.
And for people watching on video, when you talk about regular order, could you just explain what you mean by that?
Well, the Congress has developed a set of rules and practices and traditions. And those things are very important. They represent the accumulated wisdom of about 1,000 years of parliamentarians, most of which were a lot smarter than me and most of my colleagues. If you follow it, it's a good way. It's a system which enables you to put together a series of actions and activities which lead you to the point where you have a good decision-making mechanism. It simplifies the big controversies and complications.
And Mr. Chairman, here we're talking about subcommittees, committees. Tell them specifically what you mean by regular order.
Well, regular order simply means that you follow the rules and practices and traditions of the House. And it results in a very good decision-making process. It brings everybody in. It lets everybody from the far right to the far left, Republicans and Democrats, to function under rules which tell them what their rights are and how you achieve a particular result. It's a good thing. And members are comfortable with it, and they like it. Well, of course, when Newt Gingrich came in as Speaker in '94, he began dropping the regular order, and he ran most things out of the Speaker's office and the Rules Committee. And it's a very convenient way of doing it. And if you do it right, you can, and you have enough votes, you can get away with it. And you can legislate there, and you can do it rather speedily without going through all this unpleasantness of having to bring everybody in, listen to them, and hear what everybody has said about how the legislation ought to be. And frankly, when the Democrats came in, they found it to be a comfortable and convenient way to do. And it lets you crowd a lot of legislation through faster than you might otherwise be able to do if you were to take the long and tedious practices of legislating under the regular order. But understand that if you're in a big hurry and you want to get it done, you're willing to sacrifice quality for quantity and for speed. And we're finding that that's still a situation that obtains in the House. But Henry has chosen to take the more orderly fashion. Now, right at the particular minute, he doesn't have the votes, and which means that right now he's trying to build his consensus and his votes. He's doing a very good job. So I'm always happy because I'm one of those unfortunate atavisms that happens to be a traditionalist, and that means I like the old way, and I'm comfortable with it. And I find that it produces the best legislation. You start tinkering around with the rules and playing games, and you're going to stub your toe and do dumb things because you don't have the safeguards against that exist.
Now, Mr. Chairman, Minnie Luber earlier referred to the stronger EPA, and the other day you spoke out in favor of a statement made by the President's EPA that they were going to go ahead and regulate greenhouse gases. Is that a fallback position for the administration if they don't get this legislation, or is that something that should happen on top of what may come out of the Congress?
I think the administration is using that as a club or a whip or a goad to make the House and the Senate act on this legislation. A bill can be written, and if you're willing to take a slightly gradualist approach, we can get a bill fairly quickly, and a pretty good one. That'll mean that we'll have to do other things.
Mr. Chairman, what would a gradual bill look like?
Oh, I'd rather you would know it when you saw it.
Okay.
It's like beauty. But having said that, I'd rather talk about what you do to get this bill, which is really the important thing. We need to get a good bill, and the fact that everybody has been crowding to get their way, and we've had an awful lot of ruin from both sides, rule or ruin, and the result of that has been that we haven't gotten a bill, writing good legislation is not hard. It's like pushing a wheelbarrow up a hill. You're always amazed at how much work you have to do and how many unpleasant surprises as you get as you do these things. And everybody's in a big hurry. The environmentalists are very confrontational and very reluctant to have things done in any way except that which they happen to subscribe to. And that's no way of legislating, because legislation should be done on the basis of compromise and conciliation and cooperation. If you do that, the system works. If you don't, you're headed for trouble.
Mr. Chairman, to switch things up a little bit, we have a couple of questions from the audience. If I may ask this, Mr. Chairman, I have a question from Casey from West Bloomfield, Michigan. How will new energy policies be incorporated with the automotive industry to create a stronger auto industry and a brighter Michigan?
Well, everybody says that the automobile industry's been making cars the American people didn't want. I go into showrooms a lot of times. I haven't seen anybody that's standing there with a gun to make some guy buy an SUV. People buy SUVs because they like to ride around in big cars.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just guessing you get pretty good service when you go into a showroom.
I do. But so does every other American if they go to a showroom that's run by a smart fellow, because that's the way they stay in business.
Right.
But having said that, the administration hasn't really taken a hard look at what happens if they regulate this under the Clean Air Act. it's going to be a glorious mess. You have a potential for somewhere between 103 and 309 different rules and regulations that I could figure to regulate CO2 emissions and automobile emissions and air pollution. You'll have to do it, for example, under the State Implementation Act or under the New Source Review Act, which are tedious provisions indeed. As a matter of fact, most states have not yet completed getting their state implementation plan approved.
Right. And so, Mr. Chairman, I want to make this clear. I misspoke when I said earlier, what you liked about the administration's announcement was that it was a club, that it was an impetus for the committee to do its job.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure I'd say it that way, but anybody with any brains who studied this thing understands that we've simply got to regulate it. Mm-hmm. And I want to commend Chairman Waxman and the administration. They come out and said, we've got to have one single standard. If you look back to the days of the Constitution was triggered by the fact that everybody was, quite frankly, screwing their neighbor every way they could, and it related to commerce. So they got everybody together in Philadelphia in 1789, and in something like 90 days, they wrote a constitution to solve this problem, even though everybody thought it was not doable. And so we're going to find out again if we have every state writing 2 or 3 or 4 regulations on the same point, you're going to have the most unbelievable mess that you can ever get. And it isn't going to just be the auto industry that's going to catch hell under this situation. It's every other industry.
Mr. Chairman, a question from Tiffany from East Lansing. How do you see Michigan's workforce and economy meshing with green jobs?
Well, our governor is doing a remarkable job. She got $335 million through authorization through the legislature. Remarkable accomplishment to be used to create green jobs. And she's putting the whole thing into making wind generators. And so that Michigan will be the capital of that kind of production. And she's making a tremendous effort at high-tech health. She's using the universities to serve as a focus for the creation of jobs, and they're tremendous job creators. She is also going to tie into a $2 billion item I got through in the last energy bill, which will enable us to finance very well the construction of wind turbines and things of that kind. And, you know, switching over from one kind of industry to another, it's not easy.
Mr. Chairman, do you see more promise in solar or wind, or where do you see biofuels? Where do you see promise?
The hard fact is nobody knows.
Mm-hmm.
You have several things. First of all, the country is huge. Second of all, it has all kinds of climate and other situations that dictate that the situation in one part of the country is going to be different than the other. Some places the sun shines, some places it doesn't. And in some places lots of hydropower, in some places there's not. The solution to our problem on energy is mixed. We're going to have to use everything from solar to wind to water to petroleum to coal to nuclear. And all of the above are going to have to be used. The mix will be different in each part of the country, and some of it is a question of technology.
Mr. Chairman, do you believe that another nuclear power plant will ever be built in the United States?
Yep, got to do it.
Okay.
We don't have any choice.
All right. Mr. Chairman, Mills from Detroit asks your position on the use of biofuels as part of the transportation system.
It's a useful thing. But remember, when you go to biofuels, if you're going to things that produce food, i.e. the soybeans or alcohol or something like that, you're finding that you're skewing your market for food products. And you're costing the householder more money because he's got to spend more money for these fuels. Alcohol, ethanol, for example, is subsidized a huge amount. I think it's something like $16 a barrel. That's a big hunk of money. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have to see to it that as we move this direction, we follow technology and good economic sense. Otherwise, we're going to hurt the country and we're going to hurt the people. The situation here is rather similar to what you got in telecommunications. Telecommunications is evolving so fast nobody can keep up with it. And the industry is trying to figure out how they're going to stay ahead of all this technology change. So oftentimes, instead of doing the research work, they're running out and buying new companies. That's why a lot of these new companies are being sold, because they're buying technology, know-how, skills, and personnel. And you're going to find about the same thing that's going to obtain with regard to this. What has skewed the whole business has been the preference of the American people for particular kinds of things. The fact that we've had cheap oil in this country and cheap energy. When gasoline hit $4 a gallon, all of a sudden it hit sort of a tipping point. In Europe, gasoline is running about $7.50 to $10, amazing, yeah. and it causes behavior. They also have set their tax structure to encourage that, because most of that money is tax. Helmut Kohl, when he came over here, said couldn't work up much sympathy for a country that could solve its problems with a 50-cent gas tax, and wouldn't do it. And so we're not doing what we should do in those areas. And if we had changed our situation so that we had higher priced fuels, people in this country would behave differently. In Europe, they have diesel because they use their tax structure to change the economy so that everybody finds it's better to buy diesel, which gives them a 25% advantage in mileage over gasoline.
Mr. Chairman, to get your unique perspective on something that's in the news every day, what do you see as the long-term outlook or outlook period for GM and for Chrysler separately? Start with GM.
Well, you're going to get a straight answer on that in 6 days with regard to Chrysler. With GM, you have 36 days. Yogi Berra one time said, "It's very hard to prophesy when you don't know the future." And frankly, President Obama has said he doesn't want a bankruptcy in these areas. And very frankly, a bankruptcy will carry with it some awful consequences, including losses of jobs, losses of pensions to retirees, and losses of health care. It'll cost about $125 billion instead of about $25 billion to the federal government. It is going to wipe out the health care programs of retirees, and it's going to cut back on the pensions, and it's going to create a very severe problem with regard to all of the related industries, the suppliers, the dealers, and others, because they're all tied together. This is an integrated industry, in spite of the fact it doesn't look that way. And it's going to cause severe problems for the PBGC, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. It'll cause a huge impact on their funds and resources, to the point where it may create a difficulty that the next guy that goes bankrupt may not have the money to address the problems of his retirees.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask you a tough question. A year from now, how many of the big three do you think we'll have?
We'll have 2, or we may very well have 3.
The first to go would be Chrysler.
Maybe. I would say a logical person would come to the conclusion that it would be Chrysler would be the first to go. But that is not necessarily so.
What's the path to avoid that? Yeah.
If Chrysler can arrange a merger of some sort with Fiat, a lot of their problems are going to be gone. and we'll have to see how that all works out. GM's problems are different. They all have a significant problem with the creditors, particularly the bondholders. And the bondholders are going to have to come to an idea of whether they're going to cooperate or not. If they cooperate, they're going to get a haircut. If they don't cooperate, the thing's going into bankruptcy, and the roof will fall in, and at the bottom of that is going to be the bondholders who will get nothing. So there's got to be, they've got to come to a common sense awareness that they're going to have to cut their losses. And a lot of them are what they call vultures, who come in and buy bad stuff at low prices so that they can make money on somebody else's misfortune by selling it at a higher price. It works pretty often. A lot of people make a lot of money doing this. But what they will all look like, if you have a Fiat-Chrysler merger, it'll probably be more Fiat than Chrysler. But it'll probably be working, and Chrysler will have the small platforms it wants. Chrysler's in the awkward spot of being too big or too small. They're too big to be a niche company, and they're too small to be a full market operator. GM, I think, will come out of it good, but it's going to take. I used to be a bankruptcy lawyer. It takes a while, and bankruptcies are just full of surprises.
Yeah. The idea that you can do it this prepackaged, speedy, clean, quick, it doesn't work that way.
Well, under heroic circumstances and the best of good luck, it might work. If it doesn't, there are literally thousands of motions that can be filed by thousands of parties of interest. And
Kim Kingsley's giving me the hook here, but if I may just ask you one more Coffeehouse hardball question, Mr. Chairman. When you and Mrs. Dingell celebrate New Year's Eve, do you believe that the president will have signed an energy bill, a health care bill, both or neither?
I think he will have signed both, and I intend to do my level best to see to it happens, particularly because if we don't get a health care bill this year, we won't get one.
No, why is that? Spell that out.
Well,
that's interesting to this audience.
Next year is an election year.
You have to do tough stuff in odd number of years, right, Mr. Chairman?
Election years are bad times.
Yeah.
Obama is in the middle of his honeymoon. And if everything goes well in his honeymoon, he will get his bills and so forth. And I repeat, he's doing everything just about right. And
I'm going to take just another second here because this is such a treat to hear from you. We really appreciate this. Adam Benson from your staff is here, a longtime personal friend. We appreciate your making this possible. Mr. Chairman, you were talking earlier about regular order, and you've seen the institution in a way that no one else has. What else do you see as far as a big change in the institution, and it can be something good or it can be something bad? Or something that you're glad about or something you regret?
It's enormous. When my dad came here, he had one office, one electric fan, one secretary, one telephone, no long distance, one trip a year between his home. That's all changed.
Amazing. That is amazing.
Yeah.
And where was his office? Was it in the Capitol?
5th floor Cannon Building, hotter than Billy Goat Hell in the summer.
It still is, by the way.
Today, the members are headed home. They're already, most of them already left because they're.
Thank you for staying for Starbucks.
Huh?
Thank you for staying for us. Very nice.
Okay. But the money then was, the whole budget was $6 billion. When I came, the first budget I voted on was 230-some billion. The bailout for the banks was $700 billion. Terrifying number for me. I had one trip a year. I brought my family down because I had no choice, had to.
Wow.
And, or else I wasn't going to see them for 6 to 9 months. They'd start the 3rd of January, and they'd leave the 1st of June when Pop came here. Then they air conditioned the place, and everything went to pieces because they started staying longer.
Yes.
But the volume of work got lots bigger. Mm-hmm. And the end result was that they had to be here. Of course, the war came along, and then the Congress had to be here all the time because of the tremendous burden of work that had to go to winning the war. And of course, to that was added the recovery from the Depression, which was still occurs. When I got here, members came and they stayed. They couldn't go home. I couldn't go home because I couldn't afford it. And now the taxpayers pay my way home. And I have bigger staff. I represent a lot more people. I've got 795,000 folks I serve. When I came, I had 214, which makes a whale of a difference in terms of the workload. I didn't have electric typewriters. I didn't have computers. Now I've got, the whole thing is computerized. We run a modern office, in spite of me. But the upshot is that the system requires you to be home. Now it's a question of media, and you have to respond instantly to questions about which you know very little, oftentimes nothing, which leads to a lot of mistakes. The place is vastly more partisan. When I came in, there was, and during the last days of my dad's career, there were two people here who were kind of interesting. They kind of told how the place worked. One was John Rankin, who was a militant segregationist out of Mississippi. The other was a fellow by the name of Vito Marcantonio, who was either a communist or cheating them out of dues. And they would have terrible confrontations on the floor, in which they would say terrible things about each other.
No C-SPAN.
When it was all done, they'd put their arms around each other and they'd walk off.
Yeah.
Well, the Democrats got fed up with Vito, so they went out and they formed a fusion party and they beat him up in New York. And the next election, Rankin lost. And it was interesting. Why Rankin lost was he had to have Vito Marcantonio because they had this symbiotic relationship. They were great friends. Now we don't have time to form friendships. As a result, the place doesn't work as good as it used to. That's a part of the problem. The workload is heavier. The members don't have the time here they used to have. They don't get to know each other. The committees are enormous. You have this enormous money chase. First race my dad had, he spent $10,000. It took him 10 years to pay it off. My first race cost me $19,000. I didn't think there was that much money in the world. And I beat an incumbent colleague when we got stuck in the same district for $35,000. In 2002, I had to spend $3 million to beat a colleague who spent $5 million. And the orientation of the place has changed. The workload has changed. The ability to give attention to the public's business here has changed. And very little of this has been helpful.
Mr. Chairman, your service to the public hasn't changed, and I just wanted to tell you what a treat this was. This is a conversation that I'll remember forever. I really appreciate your doing this. Thanks to Adam Benson from your staff. Thanks to Mrs. Dingell. Huge thanks to Mindy Luber, Brad Feigl, who gave us such a great perspective earlier. Very appreciative to the Politicos here, including Tim, Sarah, Kim Kingsley, people who work so hard on this, and most especially to our host, Starbucks, who really cares about these issues. I'm on calls with them. They don't. It's not just an afterthought. These are issues that they talk about as they're doing their daily business. The people who run the store, there's a lot of work. Thank you for this beautiful space. And thank you guys all for coming out, joining our conversation, and for great questions. It was great fun. Happy Earth Day.